Hi, I'm Tommy Master from data36.com, and this is the second episode of this new series where I document a new hobby project of mine that I call Growing Strawberries with a Raspberry Pi on Autopilot. In the previous episode, I told you that I don't know anything about Raspberry Pis, but that's the beauty of a hobby project. You have to learn new things, right? The first thing that I have to figure out, and that I will actually show you in this video, is how to connect to the Raspberry Pi at all. I don't have a keyboard, an extra monitor, or a mouse, so my only option here is to access the Raspberry using my Wi-Fi connection in the office, and once I have that, I can practically control this small computer from my Mac. I've Googled it, so I know it's possible. So let's do it. Okay, when it comes to learn new things, I usually follow these steps. First, I start to search for practical examples and tutorials, preferably in video format, so on YouTube, or I take mini online courses and so on. 2, I try to discover the official documentation of the project. So in this case, it will be raspberrypi.org. And then simply trial and error, I just start to do things, write code, and so on. And whenever I get stuck, I either look at the documentation or I Google stuff. Just a quick comment that anything I mention in this video, tutorials, get started materials, articles, or anything else that I will use for learning myself, I will add the links for them in the description below. Probably there will be so many that I won't mention this all the time, but remember, anything I talk about will be linked in the description. Okay, now in this project, luckily, I found a really good starting point really quickly because I knew that I wanted to use Python for my project, and so I went to YouTube and searched for Python Raspberry Pi, and immediately the second result is one of my favorite YouTubers, Sendex, who happened to have an around 1 hour long tutorial on the topic. Pretty cool. So I will just go ahead and watch that tutorial. Okay, it was a pretty good introduction. And you know, the project in Sendex's tutorial is pretty different from what I want to do in my project. Still, it feels like a good start that I watched it because it gives me a good sense of what I will exactly have to do here. And also an estimate about the size of the project. And one thing I realized that the things that really scare me are these pins called GPIOs, since, you know, I'm more like a data analyst type of person. I write code on my computer, so I got used to USB cables and stuff like that, but these little pins that all look similar, but they do different things, and the fact that if I wire something wrongly can kill my Raspberry Pi scares me. But not too much anyway, and that won't be an issue in this video because, as I said right now, I just want to connect to the Raspberry via Wi-Fi and nothing else. And that takes us to the second step. And I will just go to raspberrypi.org and check out the documentation and the get started tutorials of Raspberry. And I have to be honest here, when I started this project, first I didn't want to go with the Raspberry Pi. I actually borrowed a small microcontroller instead from my brother-in-law. I won't name the brand of the hardware itself, but the point that I didn't go with it because the producer of that microcontroller just didn't provide enough get started materials. You know, it was very poorly documented, it wasn't easy to find working examples, the tutorials were messy, so I just decided to go with something that it's easier to get started with, and this is how I ended up with the Pi. Now, getting started is pretty straightforward here. I need an SD card. That's something I actually knew, so I ordered one already. That I will have to plug into my computer and just follow the 40-second video tutorial on raspberrypi.org/software. I inserted the SD card, and the first step is to open Disk Utility and erase the card. I choose the card, which for me is untitled, and I click Erase, and I will name it to boot, and I will choose to format this in this format. To be honest, I've just Googled it, and they say I have a 16 gigabyte SD card, and they say that for that size, this is the right way to format the card. I click Erase, click Done, and there is my formatted SD card. Now I can go back and go through the tutorial. I just have to download and install the Raspberry Pi Imager, download for Mac. Okay, I will skip the installation process because it's pretty straightforward. I installed the Raspberry Pi Imager. I open it. I choose the OS. And so this is relatively new, but the latest version of the Raspberry Pi OS, it's actually called Raspberry Pi OS. Before that, it was called Raspbian. But when I record this video, it's this top version that I have to select, the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. I choose the SD card. That's the only SD card I have in this computer. And I click Write. And so, by the way, this will erase this card and create an SD card that I will be able to use boot my Raspberry Pi. Practically, this SD card will contain my operating system for the Raspberry that I will use. Anyways, I click Yes, and a pretty long installation process starts. Okay, so in theory, the operating system is ready, and I just should plug this SD card into my Raspberry Pi. But as I said, I don't really have a keyboard, a monitor, or a mouse, so I have to access my Pi via Wi-Fi using the command line and preferably an SSH connection. I won't even bother with the graphical user interface of the Raspberry Pi. I know it exists, I just won't need it. Everything I need can be done in the command line. And a quick comment here, if you don't know what is the command line or how that works, or you don't know the SSH command, go ahead and check out my bash tutorials that I linked below this video. So I will have to SSH from the command line, and for that I actually searched for a tutorial on raspberrypi.org, and I found a few that are not too bad. But everything I found here sort of assumes that I have a keyboard and a monitor, and so I can turn on the Pi, configure it locally, and I can access it only after that remotely via Wi-Fi. But in fact, what I need is to access the Pi remotely via Wi-Fi on the first hand, so I want to pre-configure the OS on the SD card before I place it into my Raspberry Pi, so it will automatically connect to my Wi-Fi, and I will see and access it on my local network. Now, after some Googling, I found the keyword that I will have to Google for, and that's pretty typical in a hobby project. When you don't know what you don't know, you cannot even Google things. But after an hour or so, I found this one, and so for a Raspberry, when you want to connect to it remotely without a keyboard or a monitor, it's called headless mode. Now, knowing this, things get easy because on raspberrypi.org, there is actually a tutorial for headless mode, and it's pretty straightforward. Well, not really. So I edited out from this video my trials and errors that took another hour at least, and I will just show you the actual solution. Following this tutorial, I will have to add a file with the Wi-Fi configurations, and when I turn on my Raspberry, it will automatically connect to the Wi-Fi in my office. That is the same Wi-Fi that my personal computer is connected to. The internet is not even needed. Only being on the same network is the prerequisite of being able to SSH to the Raspberry from my computer. And the file should look like this. And I will just go ahead and copy paste this into a new file in Sublime Text. And I need to replace a few things. First of all, this is going to be my country code. It's HU for me. The SSID is the name of my network. I will type it in. And I will also have to add my password. This is my Wi-Fi password. And this should be saved and added to the boot folder, so the main folder on the SD card. I will save this to boot, and the file name should be, according to the tutorial, wpa_supplicant.conf. Save. And by the way, you can do this from any basic text editor on your computer, but I recommend using Sublime Text, which is my favorite editor for coding. If you don't know it, I added a tutorial about it in the description, and this should work. But as it turned out, and that's the part that I struggled with a little bit, so as it turned out, you can't connect to the Raspberry automatically via SSH, even if it's on the same network as your personal computer, because you will also have to allow SSH connections, which is pretty simple. Well, only if you find the right part of the tutorial, which is a little bit hidden. So how to remote access your Raspberry Pi, click here for more information. Here is the SSH access, and scroll down here. Point is, to allow the SSH connection, I had to create a new file, an empty file called SSH to the boot folder. So I will just create a new file. It has to be empty. I will save it to the boot folder, main folder of my SD card, and I will save it as SSH, and that's it. And from that point on, I can SSH to my Raspberry Pi using Wi-Fi. And again, I had to add only two files, this empty SSH file and the wpa_supplicant.conf with the Wi-Fi name and password. Now, of course, the next step is that I will remove this SD card from my computer and put the micro SD card version of it into the Pi here. And I will also have to turn on the Raspberry. Which is as simple as plugging it in. Okay, it's working. So in theory, I should be able to find and see the Pi on my network. And for that, I will just have to open a terminal window on my Mac and type the arp-a command, which lists the available devices on my network. And one of these should be called Raspberry, but I cannot see it here. So let me Google a little bit. Okay, after some Googling, I found that probably this will be the Raspberry. By the way, there are 5 devices on this network. This first one is the modem or the router of my network. This one is probably my phone. I don't know what these are, but this one should be the Raspberry Pi. And I can test this very easily because, as I learned from Sendex's tutorials, I can SSH in like this, SSH pi at and the IP address. And pi is the default username for all Raspberry Pis. And if this is the right IP address, then probably I will just be able to log in. So far, so good. And actually, the password is default as well, which is rasp Raspberry. So I type that in. And here we are. It's working. Great. See, there is Pi at Raspberry on the prompt. I clear my screen. So there it is. And this means that indeed, this will be the IP address of my Raspberry Pi on my local network. And I mean, right now, this is my Raspberry Pi from the command line, of course. And this is a beautiful Linux-based operating system that I can interact with using simple command line commands. Again, if this is very new for you, you don't know anything about the command line, check out my bash tutorials in the description because I don't want to spend too much time with the basics. The point is that from now on, I can control this Raspberry Pi using my personal computer and the Wi-Fi. All I need to do is SSHing in every time I want to do something. I can actually do this again, exit, and then SSH Pi at the IP address of the Pi. The password was Raspberry, and there it is. And before I finish this video, I will do a few more settings. For instance, I will change my password to make this a bit more secure than a simple default password. With the passwd command, the current password is Raspberry. The new password is something I won't tell you in this video. I have the new password, I will test it out. Excellent, it's working. And I will just discover what's on this Raspberry. Let's see, I don't know what folders we have by default. Oh, there is a bookshelf. What's in that? Ah, a beginner's guide. Very nice. I'm pretty sure that with cat I cannot read PDFs. Whatever. Okay, I just stopped this. Okay. So I won't use this one for now. Okay, what else? Well, let's see. Do we have Python 3? Well, I know we do, but it's good to see it's working. Print hello world. It's working great. Also, let's see what Python libraries we have access to by default. Help modules. Okay, I'm waiting. Okay. Scroll back up. Oh, quite a few libraries. I won't go through all these, but we have NumPy installed. I don't think I will use it in this project though. Let's see. We don't have pandas, but that's understandable. It's a very data science specific library. We have these GPIO 0 and GPIO 0 CLI. I don't know what these are, but I'm pretty sure they are very Raspberry Pi specific libraries. Anyways, I'm pretty sure I will have to install a few more in the next episodes, but that's it for today. Okay. Well, just one last thing. To turn on the Pi, I just had to plug it in, but to shut it down, well, there is no button for that, at least no physical button for that on the Raspberry. So I will just do it from the command line using the sudo shutdown now command. And this will immediately shut down my Raspberry Pi. And with that, this is the end of this episode. I managed to access the Raspberry Pi via Wi-Fi without a keyboard, monitor, or mouse. And as it turned out, it's called the headless mode. But the point is that it's working. So in the next episode, I will focus on making the moisture sensor work. It will be exciting because I will have to use these GPIO pins that I'm so afraid of. But hopefully it will all work out okay. More about that in the next video. And if you like this one, please subscribe, leave a rating, or even better, a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter at data36.com/newsletter, because this is the only place where I really communicate to my audience right now. So this is where you can get notified about new content as well. And if you do subscribe, you will get access to a lot of free data science learning materials too, like a Python cheat sheet, an SQL cheat sheet, or a free mini course called How to Become a Data Scientist. Thank you for watching. I'm Tommy Mester from data36.com. See you in the next video.